Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, have anti-Japan protests in China gone too far? We speak with Chinese netizens on the ground about the protests and about how much they represent broad public concern. Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for all your live feedback. Malika, quite a difference between the violent outbursts on the streets of Chinese cities and the online discussion that's happening on the web throughout China.
You're right, there is a difference, and that's kind of what we want to parse out here today. Why is it that cooler heads are prevailing online, and what does this say about the nature of the protests? So for those of you at home, if you'd like to answer those questions, tweet us. Use the hashtag AJStream.
And to Malika's right, my left is David Wertheim. He's the co-founder and editor of Tea Leaf Nation, an online magazine making sense of Chinese issues through social media. David, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Also in the stream today is a panel of journalists and bloggers on the ground in China and Japan, where it's in the middle of the night right now, by the way. They're in our Google Plus Hangout. Hey guys, thanks for staying up late with us. We're looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts. And for those of you who would like to join in future Hangouts, make sure you add us to your circles. You can do so by going to the link that you see at the bottom of your screen. And right now, we're going to show you some of the hashtags that we're following today. For days, protesters took to the streets of more than a dozen Chinese cities, upset with Japan's purchase of the disputed Diaoyu Senkaku Islands that China feels belong to them. The protests were said to be mostly peaceful, but in some cases, did they go too far? In Beijing, for example, demonstrators besieged the Japanese embassy. In other cities, fires broke out at a Panasonic electronics plant and a Toyota Motors dealership, leading both operations to have to shut down temporarily. And although the Chinese government has publicly condemned the violence, they did show tolerance toward the protests, which led some to believe that the government's hands were involved in an attempt to reignite nationalist fervor. But many web users in China are having a different discussion on patriotism and how it should be expressed. On Weibo, for example, a popular Chinese microblogging website, users urged calm and restraint from violence and vandalism. Others talked about being reasonable patriots by expressing their sense of nationalism in peaceful ways. So, why is there a big difference between the street protests and the netizen discussions? Is popular nationalism in China a state-led strategy that's aimed at bolstering its legitimacy and state control, particularly in a time of political transition? To help us answer some of these questions, we're joined via Skype from Beijing by Michael Anti. He's a columnist and internet researcher. He's been monitoring the online discussion that Chinese web users are having about the anti-Japan protests. Michael, welcome back to the stream.
My pleasure.
So, you know, I think we can all agree that there is a lot of history here that is very complicated. You know, China and Taiwan and Japan have all laid claim to this small series of uninhabited islands, and we could probably spend the whole show talking about that. So we're not going to do that. We really want to get into the social media aspect of this, and particularly the protests that are going on. And David, are you surprised at all by this? Not just the uncharacteristicness of these protests because they've been so big, but also the level of violence that is accompanying them.
I would say I'm not particularly surprised. Obviously, anti-Japanese sentiment has been, in China for a very long time. I also think it's clear from a larger perspective there are a number of social pressures and social problems within China. There are mass incidents, so-called mass incidents, every day. They're not always related to foreign affairs, but sometimes they are. So I would say I'm actually not particularly surprised.
Michael, what are your thoughts on that? Are you surprised by the size of these protests and the fact that they're even being allowed to go on?
I think because we experienced the anti-Japan, the protests in 2005, that 7 years after, but the only difference is this is the Weibo era. That's the first Weibo era anti-Japan, protests. So you can see more than 100 cities they have this Weibo, but also not only that, but also we can watch the pictures and videos of what is happening to Weibo, and the netizens, the opinions can feed back on the ground. So make these things appealing and protest quickly become topics of the internet, even the international media. So that everything's faster.
Well, we asked at the top of the show to our community members if cooler heads are prevailing online. We got an answer from Sareb, who says that's up for debate as well. Those online are also stoking the fires for the public protests over the disputed islands. I'd like to go to our Google Plus Hangout now to get the thoughts from Xia Qing, who's speaking to us from Hong Kong. Xia Qing, go ahead.
Hi. Actually, I wouldn't say that on Sina Weibo and on the street are two different words, but it's quite different. The netizens on Sina Weibo, they're quite rational towards the whole protest, starting from August 14th till 2 days ago. So they shared a hashtag, they posted a hashtag like love the country rationally, and they got over 6 million posts, and people are supporting that. Although most of the netizens, they deeply believe that the Diaoyu Island is part of China, and they're supporting boycott Japanese products, but they are quite rational, and they wanted to like the protesters on the street to calm down and think about their behavior, whether it's going to hurt Chinese people more than express their anger, and what's the value of doing it. So there is one really interesting post that's been going viral on Sina Weibo. People say, like, if you read the Sina Weibo post, that you think China is a democracy, but if you go on the streets, you will think that China is still going through cultural revolution. So that's really different scenes in China.
And that's something we want to get into a little bit later in the program. But for now, David, I'd like you to comment on, given what we just heard, how do you explain the level of violence?
How do we explain the level of violence? Well, gosh, it's always hard to say what's going on inside the hearts and minds of people who are out there protesting. I mean, I think, again, a lot of these protesters tend to be rather young. They have gone through an educational system that has taught them about Japan's wartime atrocities and emphasized those atrocities. And so when this challenge is issued to what they feel is their national sovereignty, and it's not the first challenge that they feel has been issued, I think some people get violent. At the same time, I think it's important to be clear. A lot of this violence, basically all this violence, is Chinese on Chinese violence, right? So there's the smashing of Japanese-made cars, but these are cars that are owned by and purchased with the money of Chinese citizens. So I think...
But also like the looting and the damaging of restaurants that are owned by Japanese people who are Chinese citizens.
Exactly. I mean, I think to some extent it's protesters who are venting their spleen over a variety of issues, and even in some cases people who have now a pretext to do what they want to do. I mean, I think it's hard to say that this violence is necessarily rational or necessary, but it, as Michael said, it tends to feed on itself.
Well, and there's also been some speculation as to the government's role in all of this. Michael, a Chinese dissident artist, Ai Weiwei, he passed by the protest on Sunday, and he said that he believed that the demonstrations were sanctioned by the government and the police. And he even told Reuters that Chinese citizens need to thank the Japanese government because for the first time they could mount large protests on their own land. And he also said that in China there are no protests organized by the people. What's your sense of that? Do you think the government had some role in this?
But given the fact that Chinese is not a free country, you can go on the street to protest anytime you want. No, definitely not. If you really want to go on protest to talk about the democracy or demolish the land, basically you will be detained. So in this particular case, you can see the violent. I have no 100% evidence to show that the government have intentionally to release the violence, but at least the government has a responsibility to not control the violence, because if they want to control, everything will be in their hand.
And speaking of that, there's a tweet here from Aaron Gans who says, what can the difference in online and offline protests and commentary on the islands tell us about the Chinese government's role? That's also echoed here by Porfirio, who says the government in China doesn't allow protests. So why are they allowing it now? Obviously, they are fueling the protests, she says. But what's the difference? Can you speak on the difference between allowing and maybe sanctioning?
Right. I think, I think the government clearly is allowing the protest, and within the context of mainland China, to allow a protest is, to some extent, to sanction it. In this case, we have protests that have been going on now for quite some time. I think from the Chinese government's perspective, and again, I am forced purely to speculate here, it's a question of management. I'm not sure that it's something that they can snuff out right away, but I don't see the evidence that this is something that is entirely orchestrated either. So I think instead it's an effort to ensure that the protests don't go out of hand, that there isn't, for example, blowback against the government. You know, protests like this, while anti-Japanese to begin with, can become protests about other issues, can become a platform for people to air other grievances at the government. And I think they're trying to manage that process.
Let's go to Google Plus now, where Violetta has been covering these. She's a Global Voices blogger, and she's based in Hong Kong. Violetta, go ahead.
Well, from Hong Kong, there is a general belief that, of course, the protests in China are controlled by the government, and of course, much of the reason is what has been already said. But there is another reason, and there is that it's really suspicious that being this kind of protests are very dangerous for the Chinese government. They can turn into an anti-government protest at any time, and we've seen that some protesters have been already arrested for just holding for human rights banners and things like that. So they are taking a very great risk by allowing these protests. And so the question from Hong Kong is, what are they trying to hide, or why are they taking this great risk? Are they maybe trying to distract attention from other more important issues, like you said, the leadership transition, or the downfall of the economy?
Well, Violetta, I think that's a good question. Michael, I'd like to pose that to you, but I want to let you know that it's echoed here on Twitter. Chris says, the islands are not the main point in these anti-Japan protests. The Chinese government wants to use it to distract internal political and economic conflicts. Michael?
Yes, I think because that this is a very complicated moment, because it's not only about the historic anniversary of the Japanese Sino-Japanese conflict, but also it is the eve of the 18th Party Congress. I think something we still want to know anything really happened behind this protest, but at least we think, I agree with David, Chinese government want to show the world is a controlled anger that Chinese government is not happy with the Japanese government changing the status quo of this island.
Michael, picking up on something that both David was talking about in terms of the danger of blowback, and then Violetta echoed those thoughts. I want to show our community some pictures that you actually alerted us to and then translated for us. It's a little slideshow here of some other demonstrators in China. This one, his shirt says, "Feeding corrupted officials and being house slaves. We never get up to the Diaoyu Island. Bro patriotic." This one says, "Please abolish the labor camp system before protecting the Diaoyu Island, or you will be sent there after you protected the island." And I'll just give you one more here. This one's about health care and Social Security. "With no health care and no Social Security, you should keep Diaoyu Island in heart. Even the government doesn't care about the retired." And it goes on to talk about human rights. Michael, talk a little bit about what happens to these kinds of people during the protests in China.
In some cities, when they show this kind of, very unique the slogans to the Weibo world, because they take the pictures to Weibo, let people know, and quickly they will be detained by the police, and then released a day after. But at least the Chinese government want to control these unique slogans because they want to this anti-Japan protest become a real only in the direction they allow people to do.
Right, you know, the one I'm showing right now, they're talking about corrupted officials. I mean, clearly that is not a message that the government would want out. David?
No, absolutely not. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing I think that the government is worried about and the reason that they feel that they have to manage these protests. But I did want to just raise one issue at the risk of stating the obvious. I mean, we can't say purely that this is based on what we know, this is nothing more than a screen to keep out of view these internal issues as the leadership changeover approaches. I mean, this nationalization, this purchase of the Diaoyu Islands by Japan happened when it happened. And there's obviously no evidence that China had a hand in that happening. So I think we have to keep in mind that although the government may have tried to adjust the level of anger, this is an event that is an extrinsic event beyond their control.
Right. I'd like to go for a follow-up on that to Google Plus, where Helen's a freelance journalist in Beijing. And Helen, you tweeted earlier, and this is also mentioned at the top of the show, from a Weibo user, get onto Weibo, you think China is not far from democracy, go onto the streets, and you realize the cultural revolution is not over. Helen, what are you seeing?
Right. So when I was in Beijing last week, I was at the protest. I was at the scene of the protest, and I was there, and I was thinking that maybe some people there, some protesters, may also have democratic pursuits. Because I was there, and then suddenly from the crowd jumped out of this man who was yelling something that nobody could really hear, but then somebody heard the word taxpayers, and before he could finish his sentence, he was dragged away by the policeman into a special quarter where only police could enter. And so obviously he was not trying to protest against the Japanese, he was trying to say something else. But then the police took him away, and then you could see the crowd, walking along the streets, turn angry at the police for a moment before, the police tried to push them away. So this just shows how easily this could turn, and how easily, and how dangerously it is for the government, to try to encourage this anger, to feed the anger while trying to control it, because it's not always easy to control.
Yeah, and of course, the flip side of that is something we touched on earlier in the program, which is the internet and Weibo has provided this very unique platform for people to be having these rational online discussions in a civil manner about patriotism, about nationalism, and really drilling down on these issues in a way that really represents democratic thought. My curiosity, Dave, is this somehow establishing some new pattern, even though it may be, in a very infant stage in China, that at some point may gain enough momentum where it could move to the streets?
Yeah, that's the sort of million-dollar question, right? Is when will and how does online sentiment actually move to the streets, and how does it affect what happens on the streets? And I agree. I think we're not there yet, but I think it's quite, from a democratic perspective, quite a promising development. I think, although it is censored, although there are all sorts of online mechanics and game mechanics that cause extreme opinions to become perhaps too prominent, nonetheless, it is the closest thing China has to sort of a simulacrum of democracy. Mm-hmm. So at the very least, I think, although as many will say, it provides a steam valve for discontent, and in that way maybe actually anti-democratic, I think it also does provide social proof. It shows people with minority opinions that they're not alone, and it gives the government a window into what its citizens are thinking that it may not have had before.
Michael, I want to get your thoughts on the very same thing.
Yeah, I think these things, because this anti-Japan protest, you can't easily just say it's also a practice of people, citizens go on street for protests. No, because sometimes you can see very strong hand of the governmental say intention, but also very important thing to occur more rather than the last time the anti-Japan is more picture, more signal about Mao Zedong. You see more Mao picture in this protest, which really alienate the Weibo user, because Chinese Weibo users, they use the smartphone. Basically, they belong to more middle class than the people smashing, looting on the street in those protests. So you can see the division between the the protests and the Weibo of public opinion. So I think internet really can make people know and get the information quickly, but also but you cannot say directly this kind of the information can lead people to the democracy, because people need the basic rights of the organize and go on street, which is didn't allow.
We're speaking a lot about the sentiment in China, but I'd like to shift to what Japanese are thinking, and I'd like to go to our Google Hangout, where Morley is stayed up late for us, and he's in Tokyo, Japan. Morley.
Hi. Thanks for having me on. The atmosphere in Japan is one of confusion. When you look at Twitter, many people are simply stunned, as if they were suddenly slapped in the face by a good friend. Most of us in Japan don't understand why the Chinese are angry at us. I mean, you know, from the Chinese end, this might sound laughable, but on the Japanese end, the idea is that the Japanese government and the Japanese people have been, you know, trying to make concessions to the Chinese for quite a long time, because the Chinese tend to get angry over something which the Japanese don't understand. So, you know, the Japanese are extending a hand of friendship, and all of a sudden, once in a while, you know, seasonally, the Chinese suddenly get angry, and the anger boils over into the streets, and then now all this violence. I think most Japanese feel that way, that this is just sort of incomprehensible. Why are the Chinese angry? Are they angry at themselves? Is there something else that's actually going on? Is the government doing this? Is this part of a power struggle? Why are there Mao Zedong portraits? You know, all these questions are many, many question marks among Japanese Twitter users.
David, why do you think that is? Do you think there's really a lack of connection between the Japanese people and these larger issues? Or is it something else?
I'm probably not qualified to say, but I will say that anti-Japanese sentiment, that, you know, hurt feelings over what has happened in the past are still very deep in China and very significant. And it may not manifest itself all of the time, but when there is an opportunity for it to manifest, it can be quite fierce. You know, I lived in and near a city called Chongqing in China's interior, which had been very seriously bombed by Japanese forces, and there was a real undercurrent of anger, and it was very common for people to say that they hated Japanese people. So I think that's been there for some time.
All right, we're going to continue this discussion in our online post show. So our thanks, of course, to David and Michael and members in our Google Plus Hangout. Everybody sit tight. But before we go, here's Malika, because she's got some other story leads that we're following.
The Spanish woman who gained notoriety for altering a painting of Jesus now wants to copyright her unique work. 85-year-old Cecilia Jimenez attempted to restore this 19th century fresco and failed. Her effort led to mass criticism, but also sparked an internet craze, resulting in pages like this one on Pinterest, where users submitted their own restorations. According to El Correo newspaper, Jimenez now wants a piece of the pie, including some of the money her church collects from tourists flocking to see the botched art, shown here on the Peregrinos blog. Netizens are skeptical. The real miracle is that the artist behind the restored monkey Jesus fresco waited this long to assert copyright, tweets Parker. The Diceman agrees. Anyone who felt sorry for the woman who fixed the Spanish Jesus fresco can stop now. Our next lead looks at a fundraising campaign for a Wi-Fi-enabled light bulb. Using a smartphone app, users can control the bulb from anywhere, turning it on and off, choosing its brightness, and getting notifications for Twitter and Facebook through the flicker of a light. The campaign on Kickstarter.com received more than $1 million in donations in just 4 days, even though the inventors only asked for $100,000. We're tweeting out the links to more on both of those stories, so follow our feed at AJ Stream. Lisa?
All right, and stay with us, because as promised, the post show is next. It's stream.aljazeera.com. Now, on Monday, caught on tape, video volunteers are taking on India's caste system so that no one is treated as untouchable. We want to hear your thoughts on that, so tweet us. And until then, we'll see you online. Welcome back to the Stream's online post show. We're talking about China and Japan and the conflict that's erupted over Japan's purchase of the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. And I want to go back to one member of our Google Plus Hangout, Morley Robertson from Tokyo, Japan. You know, on Tea Leaf Nation, which is run by our studio guest, Dave Wertheim, there was a long post from a Chinese student in Japan who said there are 100,000 of us here and we get nothing but friendly reception from the Japanese. They like us, they're friendly to us, they try to talk to us in Chinese, talk about how much they like our culture, our food, which might lead someone to believe that this is more about the governments and issues between them than the people. Is that your sense of things at all?
My sense of things is that this might be actually based on class, you know, like a division of haves and have-nots. China's prosperity is dependent on global commerce, which means that it will naturally centrifugally pull apart the wealthy and the poor, with the wealth concentrated into the few percentile. The Chinese who visit Japan on holidays are, you know, seem to be extremely wealthy by the Japanese. They're buying diamonds. I've watched groups of Chinese tourists buying diamonds. So when we look at Chinese tourists, we think of an affluent new China, which is, you know, almost democratized and capitalized. So we get this false illusion that China is now, you know, doing what Japan did 30 or 40 years ago. But then, you know, reality is very different on the ground within China. I think that's what's causing the discrepancy.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a follow-up in Google Plus from Xiuqing. Go ahead. Xiuqing, it looks like you might need to unmute your microphone. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, sorry. Yes. So sorry, can you repeat your question? The internet was not very stable.
I'd like you to follow up on what Morley was just talking about, and that the Japanese reaction, and then what this means in China. Does this mean that the government is provoking these if we're not seeing the same kind of sentiment from its actual citizens?
I actually don't have any proof to say that the government did really do something to promote this, but I do saw see posts online. People say like they overheard in elevators that people were paid 1,000 RMB per day to go protest and throw eggs or national flags in front of the Japanese embassy in Beijing. That's a post online. It got deleted right away. So I don't know if that's a proof that the government really promoted this to a lot of Chinese people. And also there are posts online telling and saying that it's kind of all the national or government-owned companies or institutions has to the workers has to go on the street. That is directly related to their work performance, their annual performance analysis. So there definitely some role that the government played at the very beginning. But I personally think the government would feel surprised at how the protests went and how the people's really gets excited about the protest and did a lot of things that are irrational. So now they probably are facing a problem. I mean, the government probably are facing this problem of how to calm it down.
That's an excellent point you make, and Michael Ante, I want you to pick up on that. Where does this go from here, and how does the government take control of something that they've sort of just let have a life of its own?
I think now already the situation will come back, you know, it come back to the old days, because 7-Eleven now is reopened after 2 days shutdown, and also, you know, Chinese government used the text message to warn people not really want to go on street to do the anti-Japan protests. Because very important things, the Diaoyu Island, this dispute is basically the diplomatic, you know, issue. Is not really, it's like a domestic issue in China. Or you can't, especially you can't smash the Chinese citizens' car and looting Chinese citizens' restaurant. It doesn't make any sense. So basically, I think this several days protest has already ended, but now it left to the Japanese and the Chinese governments to have a risk management over this island, because this is not just the rocks in the ocean. It's very fundamental issue between the Sino and the Japan relationship. Both governments should settle this problem where you can't just let the people involved, let them on the front. The government always should be in the front in this particular issue.
You know, David, people in general always seem to find a way to communicate and come together and collaborate with great ideas. So I'm assuming that that's got to be happening online too. Have you seen anything where people from China and people from Japan and perhaps even Taiwan have thought of ways for the countries to work together and maybe resolve this?
Well, I haven't seen any thinking at that high of a level, but we have seen attempts on behalf of netizens to sort of reach across the divide. When we translated that piece by a Chinese student abroad in Japan,
right,
we were very gratified to see it get attention from Japanese netizens on Twitter. In a perhaps more sensational move, an adult film star who's from Japan but has a Chinese Weibo account also attempted to extend a fig leaf, although she was, I think, rebuffed more than encouraged. But we do see this happening, and I think, unfortunately, the internet remains in many ways a divided landscape, just like our topography. So, Weibo is mostly Chinese, and it's in Chinese language. Twitter is a bit more multinational, but has a smaller user base, perhaps. So I think until we have an integrated internet, it's going to take extra effort for people to reach across these divides.
Or more work from Tea Leaf.
I hope so.
Speaking of reaching across these divides, I want to go back to Google Hangout, where Morley has a comment. Go ahead, Morley.
Hi, I'd like to say that in general, most Japanese citizens have a deep respect for Chinese culture. The problem is that we're not getting any modern day information. We're not getting a constant news feed in detail about what's happening to China, how Chinese society is changing. So as a result, on both ends, China because of censorship, and the Japanese because of, say, apathy or lack of interest within the media, we're not getting a full picture of each other. And as a result, the hardliners or the right-wing politicians, all these people with people with agendas, they seem to be hijacking the dialogue. So as a result, the more quiet voices of moderation, the more intelligent people on both ends are not being able to meet each other. That's my impression.
And I think on that note, I'm going to read one tweet from Kylene Kang. Someone needs to start a China Loves Japan campaign. These protesters can't speak for the entire nation. On that note, our thanks to David Wertheim, Michael Ante, and everyone in our Google Plus Hangout. Thanks for being up in the middle of the night with us, guys. And of course, to our online community for tuning in to our show. Now, tomorrow, or Monday rather, we're going to talk about something that's been caught on tape. Video volunteers in India are taking on the caste system there. They say it's so that no one is treated as untouchable. It promises to be a really interesting show, so be sure to tune in and tweet us your thoughts on that in the meantime. And until then, we'll see you online.